Alright, so since I'm on a Kuehn kick, I decided to continue with this. Couple things. I did a little bit of research in Ancestry because I, since I do have an accounting background, I do like to test assertions here or there. Also, I have another document that goes into more details about why his sentence was commuted. And additionally, I was fortunate enough to come across a book that was written by an individual who now his name escapes me, but I'll know shortly who it was, that wrote a book on the same subject that I'm talking about, pretty much. Um, and his name is Jay Feldman. Um, and he has a book that was called, let's see books. It is called in fact, there's two books that are very good by him, on completely different subjects, but I've read them both, and it's quite a coincidence. And this one is called Manufacturing Hysteria, and he did some talks on it. There is a presentation on it on Book TV. You just click through, you'll finally get to it. It's about an hour long. He did this in September 1911, and he pretty much covers the same subject. And and since he's pretty much covered the history of this kind of thing going on in government, um, from just an observational point of view, and has some very moving stories in the hour presentation that he has there. Um, in some cases, he does go into details. Um, he doesn't really get into specific people that were carted off to the internment camps in Texas for Germans during World War II, but he does brush upon the subject over a lot of things, and he basically just, the point of his whole book is to point out a problem that he observes, the same problem that I observe that he has no solution for, and I have no solution for. I mean, public awareness is about all you can do. I mean, people that are in positions of responsibility could step back and think twice about what they're doing in certain circumstances. Another book he wrote, it's called When the Mississippi Ran Backwards, and it touches on the San Madrid earthquakes, and there's some other content in there that I was doing another project on that was helpful. And I know that he's a very good researcher, and he spent a good amount of time researching and getting a lot of detail on something that's not really necessarily all that germane to the book. He's just a local from um, the area where the New Madrid earthquake took place. There was a huge earthquake that took place well over 100 years ago in Mississippi. Probably maybe on the at the this could have, it was probably pretty bad. Maybe almost on the scale of the recent Nepal earthquake by some descriptions. Of course, we didn't have seismographs back then, so we can only guess how bad that was. But it was just a horrific earthquake. So we should know that we probably have two very large magma pools sitting below our continent. But okay, that's not really the subject of what I'm going to do. But if you want to read more on this kind of thing, I would recommend Jay Feldman's book, which I haven't had a chance to read myself, but based on what he talked about, I know, and some of the snippets that he read, he's careful, he's detailed, and if he does, later visit some of the people that were involved in some real human tragedies, he's also gracious. He's a good guy. He's a little quiet. He's not very forceful, but he has forceful ideas. You just can't tell when you see the guy talking. So anyway, just wanted to, his website is jfeldman.com. All right, so to get back to this, So the third thing I was able to get was actually a typewritten document about basically a high-level general in Hawaii that had some decision-making abilities and choices, and what his rationale was behind his commuting of, the death sentence to 50 years for Mr. Kuehn. And then obviously someone else was involved later on when he was released. And then I'm going to go through in more detail some of these other documents that are in the Kuehn file. All right, so I went on Ancestry.com. Of course, they have passenger lists, and there are some documents that are stored in Ancestry that actually directly relate. And this part's going to be pretty much, because I've started out pretty much doing a summary, and a lot of the time I didn't say, see, that says this here on the document, and so therefore what I'm saying is true. I'm going to do that later in some circumstances. In all circumstances, I would have done that. But if I hadn't done that already, I'm going to do it. And plus, I'll even cover even more details, and it may even get redundant, but I'll probably have several of these videos. Later ones going into the contents of the documents that are in the vault, maybe even commenting on the fact that some of the things are redundant. But for now, we have the general story. And then there's also one other thing I was going to point out, but let's just talk about what the aftermath was to this family. Now, as you recall the facts, if we assume that Mr. Kuehn was lying, let's just assume he was lying for the sake of argument, even if he was lying, which I don't think he was, but just if we set that aside and just assume the government was right up to this point, we still have to ask ourselves what happened to his 3 children and wife that were not accused, never convicted of anything, never accused of anything. What happened to them? Did they stay in Hawaii and live their lives? Were they happy? Well, if you saw my last video, you know the answer already, that Mrs. Kuehn was pretty ticked off. And she even alluded to the fact that all their possessions were just simply auctioned off. I would assume that she would have some property rights as well as her husband, but she wasn't treated that way. And I was able to retrieve, there is a group that keeps track of or researches and provides information for ordinary individuals that were rounded up and put into concentration camps, basically, here in the United States during the war. Of course, we didn't murder people like the Nazis did, but we did tell people they had to leave their homes and go to some other place for a while. And so I'm going to go over the details as to what happened. So first of all, Mr. and Mrs. Kuehn had to endure, they had their last meal together, literally. The prisoners, they were prepared a special meal for their last meal when they were in, a couple guys hid behind the wall and wrote everything down that they said from the FBI. And this was after he was convicted. And in fact, I'll just start with that, and that'll be from what this is this was scanned. It's housed somewhere that it escapes me now, but this is written by Major General Thomas H. Green, who discusses martial law in Hawaii during the time period December 7th, 1941 through April 4th, 1943, and he types up the case of, he misspells it. He calls him Julius Otto Kuehn instead of Bernard Otto Julius Kuehn, but, whatever. The guy had plenty of names to go around. We know what you're talking about. Just gonna check if I'm actually getting this. All right. So, now remember that you have to look at the videos of the facts of the case. And what I say about this person, about Bernard Julius Otto Kuehn, is that he left Germany. He had to have funds smuggled out of once the Germans took over, he wasn't able to get any of his own money out of Germany. His wife was able to sell a piece of property, and the person that bought the property when he was doing business in Shanghai was able to provide little amounts of money to Mrs. Kuehn, and they were able to live off this. First he got some inheritance from an aunt. He bought some property, then he had to actually sell it because he couldn't keep it because he couldn't get a job, or he didn't the job he did find, he found it too labor intensive, and then she started to get her money. They found a way to smuggle it back out from Japan, and the Japanese were even so kind one time to actually knock on his door and hand him a brown envelope full of cash. Okay. Then the wife got the idea, let's send $500 back to our son, or her son, actually, in Germany, who wasn't a swell guy, but nonetheless, he felt he needed to figure out how he was going to get this done. And he just assumed that since the Japanese were able to get money out of Germany, that the Japanese would be able to bring money back into Germany. What he didn't remember, of course, was that their friend that had a business in Shanghai was already outside of Germany when he had delivered this money. Also, I wanted to mention that in my last video, I kept talking about getting money back into Japan. What I meant to say is getting money back into Germany. So, basically, at some point, just based on to fulfill his wife's wishes, there must have been some kind of arrangement, or with the money she wanted to give her son, so many marks a month, or so he thought he'd just send $500 and be done with it for a couple of years. So he approached the German consulate. They refused because they probably couldn't have actually have done that. And he kept talking to them and said, well, maybe you could figure out a way to get the money back in if I give you some information. And he came up with an elaborate scheme to make them think that he was going to spy for them. But he never actually did it. And then at the end, the day before the cables were sent in between the consulate or a few days or a day or so before the cables were sent in to the consulate from the Japanese government, they figured that it would take about a week for the Americans to decrypt these signals, and they might as well throw in a poison pill and get Mr. Kuehn back for not fulfilling his end of the bargain. Perhaps they did deliver the money to his son at some cost. I don't know. But anyway, so the FBI goes out and they see a Lanakai house, and they see the dormer window, and they already knew who Kuehn was, and so they confronted him with this, and Kuehn just wrote a confession as if they were just going to understand that he really wasn't spying. But instead they assumed he was spying, and so he went to trial, and he was convicted, and on the strictest interpretation of the letter of the law, even though the consulate may have been provided no new information from Mr. Kuehn, as to how many boats were in the harbor, the consulate may have already known that. But because in his confession that he wrote out, he specifically said that he told the consulate how many boats were in the harbor the day before Pearl Harbor, he was convicted for breaking the law. In the most technical sense, he did break the law. But chances are great he didn't end up giving the Japanese any additional information. And it seems quite fantastic when even though I'm claiming here that, before I get into the details here, I'm claiming that Mr. Kuehn never sent any signals actually to the Japanese. That is backed up by the information gathering that took place when the police went out and interviewed the neighbors of the Lanikai house to ask about whether any light signals, they'd ever seen any light signals come from the house. They said no. The Kuehn family wasn't in a position, at least for a month prior to the attack, to ever hang clothes on the clothesline for some submarine to look at, or for the consulate to peer out the window and see and make a note of the boats that day. Why? Because the house that he was supposed to be looking at to gather this information from, if he were to follow Mr. Kuhn's instructions, was actually occupied by two lieutenants in the Navy, that detail is revealed in a congressional report that has the exact same content of some of the redacted files that are in the FBI Freedom of Information Act file that I downloaded in PDF form. So at the end of the day, he wasn't really actually able. He knew he was in a position to not be able to supply them information. He didn't, and even though they had a confirmation that he had claimed to the FBI that he was just he was going to try to pull a fast one, or I forgot the exact verbiage, but trick them into delivering the money back to Germany, whilst not actually aiding or assisting them. And he may have actually accomplished this. They ignored that fact. They ignored the fact that he was in no position to actually send these signals, and he didn't get on the boat, which was one proposed way to deliver the signals. He wouldn't have been able to hang clothes at the clothesline at the house he was renting out to the naval lieutenants. He wouldn't be in a position to turn the lights off and on in the middle of the night, or whenever they were supposed to go on and off to signify how many boats were in the harbor, because they were there and they were occupying the house. And if those things were seen, those naval officers would have some explaining to do, not necessarily Julius Otto Kuehn. So I guess that's the short version of the detail I went into over there. But I did look at some documents to back up what I'm saying, and I'm even going to do some more. Now, this is the typewritten account of the man who had the power to say, okay, take Kuehn out to the lot and kill him by musketry, as the court had decided. And the point I'm going to make from this is it's really scary to read this, actually, given in mind that at least what I'm saying is reasonably true. In fact, it's a little more reasonable to believe he did not send the signals than it is reasonable to believe he did. Alright, so he says here there was, he had long been under surveillance by the FBI, so I'll just pause there. I mean, remember when we looked at these documents, what had happened is that the surveillance, all it was that a naval officer of some sort that was an acquaintance of Mr. Kuehn had just drawn some suspicions around the time of the German-American Bund, and had told, just wrote up the basic information on a memo and gave it to Mr. Tam, who protected their anonymity for as long as he could, until actually they forced him to reveal his information, and they labeled him from then on as confidential informant N. And they interviewed him in depth later on. But basically all it was this guy said, I think these guys are spies, they have a lot of money. The wife defends Nazi Germany. She really was psychologically defending her son, I'll argue. It was more or less of a fad follower of, and she is culpable for that, obviously, just at least being ignorant of what they did. And it could be worse than that. So, but it didn't sound like it later on in her life. So, Um, so all this long surveillance had been is the depository of a memo into the file of an unfounded belief that Mr. Kuehn was a German spy because he lived a lavish life. He liked to talk to naval officers and had no apparent income to support this lavish life. And they seem to have forgotten that he had to sell one of his houses, but nonetheless, that's what it was. And they even went so far as to approach his banker in Hawaii and then some other branch in New York, and they finally were able to get them to violate Mr. Kuhn's privacy without a warrant and find out that he had received $70,000 or $30,000, some very large amount of money that had been spent over, deposited and spent over a reasonably short period of time. And what the money was used for was to buy a home. Basically, they paid for it outright. They didn't have a mortgage. Then they used the proceeds from the sale of a home to live off that for a while, and eventually things ran out. By all accounts, they probably did live too lavish of a lifestyle. By all accounts, they probably weren't all that practical of people. They probably had lived very well their whole lives and didn't know how to deal with tighter times. Okay, that's just my judgment of them. But anyway, so this whole thing about them long being under surveillance by the FBI, this was pre-war, and they were just trying to figure out whether he was a spy. But that doesn't, he implies here there's some culpability just because the FBI is looking at them, and that's, people do that. Well, if the FBI is looking at them, there must be, they must not have told us the whole story, and there must be additional culpabilities. They're surveilling them for a reason. This thing where people assign knowledge to a body that they don't even claim they have happens a lot, and it's one causal factor for people's lives being ruined by the machinery of government. But I also got more details about the time period. Apparently the FBI was a out of control entity, even going back as far as World War I, and had done all sorts of things. There was an attempt to rein them back in, but eventually when around this time the reins had been dropped. They had some attorney general tell them not to be an investigating agency that keeps dossiers on people, but instead, once they find out someone has broken the law, to pursue the law like a normal police force. And J. Edgar Hoover had a propensity to collect dossiers on people, and that's the way FBI operated, and that became the habit of the FBI, like an almost ingrained part of the culture, which, who knows, may still persist to this day. I'm not even sure. So, and although they suspected being an enemy agent for a long period prior to the war, there was not concrete evidence against him. Okay, and then he just, all of a sudden, as if this is okay, says that all the German nationals, all the Germans in Hawaii were asked to come down to some place, or they were rounded up by the military police eventually. And eventually Mr. Kuehn was rounded up by the military police, as he says here. In this instance, the military police were unaware of the fact the FBI had a file on Kuehn, but Kuehn mistakenly believed that he had been picked up because of espionage rather because he was an enemy alien. Which I would imagine that would be true of Kuehn. So what happens is Kuhn's in the middle of the scam he's trying to pull on the Japanese. Okay, the cables from Tokyo had yet to have been translated to direct them to go to look for houses on Lanakei Beach with dormer windows. And but he was, paranoid. Apparently Mr. Kuehn was paranoid, probably couldn't believe that, in America he was picked up simply because he was German. A lot of people probably couldn't believe they were picked up just simply because they were of a certain race, or not yet a U.S. citizen and, alien from another country, this, nation of migrants. Um, and so the military police became suspicious when he starts talking about what was going on between him and the Japanese, trying to explain his circumstance. They called down the FBI. I'm restating what he's typed here because some of it's just biased. And supposedly they speedily broke the case and showed conclusively that Kuehn had been in the employ of the Japanese Consul General Kida. And let me go into details about this. So they didn't show anything conclusively. The money that was delivered through the Japanese consul, the last $14,000 that Kuehn voluntarily told them about, this wasn't, they didn't waterboard him or anything. He just told them like it was just, like they would just understand or something, was the second payment of what was going to be 3 payments from their friend and businessman that was doing business in Shanghai, that was using his profits from the business in Shanghai to pay for a piece of property in Germany, so they can circumvent the fact that the German government wouldn't allow anybody to take money outside of Germany and bring it into another nation. So these profits were born outside of Germany, and therefore he was able to, this man was able to, probably at his own risk, to deliver funds to the Kuehns in Hawaii. Why the Japanese consul? He knew them, and they were willing to do it, and they had a consul in Japan, and there periodically, someone from the government would go take a boat trip to Hawaii and talk to them. They didn't, so that's how they delivered it. That was one way. Sometimes Mrs. Kuehn would take a boat trip over to, and we'll see how many boat trips she took, over to Japan to get some money from, as the man in Shanghai would make it. And, you got to remember, they were in an awfully risky position. I mean, basically, she signed title over to a man who promised to make payments in the future, because that was the only choice she had, and that was in Germany. If she sold it in Germany, she wouldn't be able to get the cash. Even though her son was supposedly a high-ranking member, or actually, I'll just say he was a high-ranking member of the Nazi stormtroopers. So, in his confession, he writes his confession in such a way that he doesn't keep reminding the reader of what the connection is between the activity of the Japanese consul and the sale of the land, and so he just makes it sound like some strange Japanese guy that he's never seen before shows up and gives him a bag of money and walks away for no reason, which is not the case when you look at all the different pieces of information through this whole thing. And so this is why this governor here, this general, was under the impression that they had proved that he had spied, because what Kuehn had said is, well, I told him how many boats were in I set up this, plan of codes, and I told him how many boats were in the harbor, and some Japanese guy just came by and gave me an envelope full of money. And, it does sure as shit sounds like he was spying. But he just never clearly said what was going on. He just almost seemed like resigned to just let. I don't know what the deal was. He didn't really help himself, and everything happened so fast. And I'm sure he was probably, after escaping from, a country that ended up becoming under Nazi control, that I'm sure it compromised his willingness to, having been through that, compromised his later willingness to speak up for himself for all aspects of what had happened. It's also developed that Kuehn was prepared to give. That's right. His circumstances, that if he'd followed through with the preparations that he had made, yes, he would have sent signals to the Japanese. He just didn't follow through with it. And it's not because he was a sleeper agent or quote unquote inept or ineffective or whatever terms that are used on the current Wikipedia page. It's because he never planned to spy for them. And he was not paid by them to spy. They just performed a service to deliver money, I guess, just as decent human beings, at least in that regard. You know, what they did in bombing Pearl Harbor wasn't decent, but in that case, they delivered money for a man that they were doing business with. Apparently, it was in both he was in favor of the Japanese doing business in Shanghai, obviously. Then he was so he was brought to trial for military commission on January 28th, 1942. So the Pearl Harbor attack took place December 7th. I'm not sure if he says when they were arrested because they were German, but December 8th. So this was a month and 20 days, like 50 days later. He's on trial. He pleaded not guilty. I mean, he refers to other confirming evidence. Of the little bit of the trial that I've seen, what he's talking about is the Navy made a list of the number of boats that were actually in the harbor of different types on different days. And what they showed is that the numbers that Kuehn said that he told the consulate was roughly correct, but he got the submarines wrong. And the problem with this logic, of course, is that the consul probably already knew that. You know, the information he gave the consul is probably nothing new to the consul. And you can tell when you read his confession, the Japanese consul wasn't really all that interested in what he had to say. It was like they're both trying to deceive each other. The Japanese consul probably took the $500 and put it in his desk drawer. Maybe burned it when the military arrived and took him into custody temporarily after Pearl Harbor was bombed, because he was there on that day. So they were both trying to get each other to do stuff that they both were unwilling to do. But in this case, now he was going to be sentenced to be executed, and it's not written here, but he was sentenced to be executed by musketry. They took this trial, and it was reviewed by some other lawyers, and everybody kept saying, yeah, you're good to go ahead and kill the guy. And then there's one thing that kind of, I think, helped in the short term. He said, I may say that I have long doubted the value of the death penalty as a deterrent, but in this case, since so many people suffered, I was willing to say okay with that. And then he judges now that Kuehn was instrumental in the success of the attack at Pearl Harbor. I'm saying I contend that he wasn't instrumental. He provided no material information. That's what I believe. The consulate isn't blind to go outside, and there were other spies in the area. The number of boats that were in the harbor on one day is not significant to anything. It doesn't tell them whether the boats are less or more, or, He provided no information as to fleet, nothing. I mean, just of any value. The number of boats in the harbor is only good, as I said before, when you want to know if a certain, usually they only have this many boats in the harbor, but today they got a whole bunch, so maybe we ought to go today. Or maybe the shape of the harbor, like the Japanese spy that was painting the harbor, before the attack and sending those paintings back. Yeah, that was important, but this just but again, I'll say by the letter of the law, to tell the Japanese what they already knew, and in as much that Pearl Harbor had enough boats in it to be a tasty target. He let them know, even though they probably already knew, and therefore, by the letter of the law, he was guilty. So that's the gray area that we're in here, but I think for the most part, they probably should have said, once they found out no signals were sent from the Lanikai house, they probably should have realized that the extent of his activity was what he recorded in his confession. And if he really was trying to spy, he wouldn't have said any of those things. He would have waited for them to ask him about it instead of just start blurting out, as this general says. Okay, so then after the commission, he once again recommended that the sentence be approved, but delay the execution until the views of the War Department and the State Department could be made known. So they sent the whole record of the trial to the War Department. And one of the concerns was, and this is what ultimately saved his life, partially ultimately saved his life. It was exactly the issue that was addressed in the FBI file I showed in one of my earlier videos. There's a piece of paper with FDR talking with someone at the War Department as what are we supposed to do with the consul here? Are they our prisoners, or do we just let them go back? And FDR finally, because the concern was that, of course, we had our own officials over in Japan, and if we had taken the step to just simply imprison their consulate, they might do the same thing to ours. So we decided we didn't want that to happen, and so we let the consulate go back. After interviewing him, of course. And this is the same kind of concern. Well, there were some American prisoners of war, perhaps in the Philippines, or maybe not yet, but there may soon be. And they thought about whether this would set a precedent. They couldn't sort out whether he was a prisoner of war, or just they were having trouble sorting out its status, actually. So they decided to refer this to the War Department. And then it just kind of, according to him, the matter rested for a long period. Now, ultimately, the question as to what was going to be done to Mr. Kuehn took let's see, they're still trying to figure out what to do in August of the same year. He was convicted at the end of January, so this is 8th month, so 7 months later, they're still waiting for an answer. And so they finally got all the papers back 9 months after his conviction, which is less than a year. Meanwhile, the public has no idea that the United States government believes it has a German spy in its jails. No one knows. They didn't make this public till later. So let's just go back to what he says here, because some things are kind of interesting, and I don't know if he's secretly against the death penalty and subconsciously allowed it to happen, but that's good, because I wouldn't want to see him die anyway. He goes, accordingly, I recommend we approve the sentence, delay the execution to the War State Department to be done. Out the War Department, the Judge Advocate General went into the matter and rendered an opinion which went over my review in detail. And prior to the war, So this is very interesting. Um, they stated that prior to the war, the United States had met with Germany and talked about, well, if we just happen to go to war with you someday, or you happen to have spies over here, or we have spies over there, and that just happens to happen, can we agree to treat these people as prisoners of war? But the Germans never got back to us on that. Okay. And they had all the justification, we're not violating the Geneva Convention if we kill them, and military commission has the authority, and all this stuff. Don't even have to ask the president. We can just kill him if we want, he says. I was quite flattered to have the Judge Advocate General concur in our views. This is someone from the War Department. It was just still, he had the same concern, was that, if we kill Kuehn, are our citizens going to be, killed in kind? Oh. No, he talked to the Judge Advocate General. So they sent their thing to the War Department. And they never really gave him an answer that he wanted to hear. I guess he wanted to hear, go ahead and kill him. So, he took a trip out to Washington to talk to the two guys that were, quote unquote, looking over the matter. And he started to get frustrated because he spent days trying to talk with them, and they kept giving him these, all the theoretical questions that they were wrestling with over this matter. And finally he said, well, okay, then if you can't decide on whether this guy should die or not, just tell me what the worst punishment is you can give me that you have no question is not going to be a problem. And they said 50 years confinement would be something that no one could disagree with. There's no theoretical in their opinion. And then by the time the 9 months had passed, he figured to himself, well, 9 months have passed since his conviction, and therefore killing him isn't going to be effective. And so, because the 9 months, for some reason he thinks since the 9 months has passed, killing him is there's no point to killing him now, because 9 months has passed since the trial. Even though no one in the public knew the trial was going to happen, for some reason this changes his mind, and he was sent over to Fort Leavenworth, Kansas for 50 years confinement, but instead he ended up being deported, as we know. And then he tries to justify martial law down here. Because, of course, the person in power tends to want to keep it. Says, clearly the delay in the incident to final disposition in this case is one further reason why civil courts and procedures would not have been adequate in the administration of martial law in Hawaii. Well, whatever. Okay, so now let's go into the details of what happened to his kid. So, it was probably on the same day, December 8th, his wife and his son of 8. He also had a daughter that was married, not even living in the household, was a nurse, age 25 probably. They were all rounded up. Probably on December 8th. And the FBI wanted her around, the wife around, before Mr. Kuehn was going to take his last supper, to see what last words they would have, whether they could get some more information to break up other hidden German enemies from within. Of course, that didn't happen during the conversation. In fact, Mr. Kuehn referred to that conversation as evidence of his innocence. later on, um, he was actually never tried. He was just simply deported because he was no longer legally allowed to remain in the country. But anyway, so on March 13th, let's see, Friedel, the wife, and the son, Hans Julius, there was another son. Okay, so what he had over there, he had a son that was around 18, named Eberhard. And I'll go into more details about Eberhard. We're not there yet. Wife, daughter that was married, ripped out of her household and put into some temporary holding cell, which I'll get to her too, and an 11-year-old son, or 8-year-old son at the time. So I guess until they had actually decided on Mr. Kuehn's disposition, they kept the family together. This is my guess, because it wasn't until, or they got the age wrong here, maybe he was 9 years old. Anyway, it wasn't until March of 1943 that they were put on a boat for San Francisco, and they arrived on March 13th, 1943, and they were handed over to the military police, who actually then took them to Crystal City, Texas, where there was an internment camp. And this is at least 28 pages long. These are all the Germans. And as the author I referred to had said, the United States actually had demanded that other countries in South America go find German nationals, round them up, and turn them over to American authorities to be shipped to America to be interned in the Crystal City, Texas internment camp. So there's some people here you can see were from Panama, Guatemala, Honduras, and some of these people who had, maybe they were second generation Germans, actually citizens of Panama, had never even been to Germany. These aren't known spies, these are just Germans. Were then, when this whole thing was over, deported to Germany, a country they'd never been to, and it's insane. And that's one of the points that the author had made of the book I recommended. But getting back to this, so the wife is pulled from her household and now has to live in Crystal City, Texas. And this was they did a census, and they called them civilian enemy, alien enemies. So now, and we're dealing with a new set of people. So, they're put on a boat, and the people that were more familiar with their case are no longer connected with them, and they're dropped off in Los Angeles. And then there's a couple strange military police they've never seen before that pick them up and put them on a bus and drive them to Crystal City, Texas, and then they disappear. And when the last guy drops them off in the rumor mill, probably would say, "Oh, well, I think they're Nazi sympathizers," and he whispers that in the ear and drives off. It was the last message, the last important message to portray. Because some of these people ended up actually being not deported, but released back to the United States. According to the author of the book, these individuals that came from Guatemala, Panama, and the like were actually deported back to Germany after the war. So, since they have a little, Hawaii next to it, I'm sure there was in some writing somewhere that, this was a family that needed to be deported and not put back into circulation, because they were just that careless. This is what happens when you get thrown in a system where your people that are dealing with you bureaucratically switch from one person to the other. And the only message that's delivered is the most concise one because they have other things to do. Like pick up the next poor lots that need to be shipped down to Los Angeles and driven to Crystal City, Texas. All right, so then eventually, and I don't know what happened to the Hans Joachim. Actually, I really don't. I'd have to look more, but so eventually, when the war was over, this is about August 1945. Crystal City is going to close down. They got to decide what they're going to do with these people. Whether they're going to stay in custody for deportation or they're going to be allowed to go back to their lives that's probably now in shambles. I mean, they were in effect were in prison. I mean, they couldn't, if they owned a home, they wouldn't be able to maintain, they couldn't pay the rent all these years, couldn't get a job. They're just basically, their lives were ruined and they had to go back and start all over again after this. But basically between both the wife, Fredo Kuehn, and Ruth Moore, they were brandished as Nazi sympathizers. Both destined to go back to Germany. Now, according to Miss Kuehn, eventually Ruth Moore returned to America, but ended up marrying somebody else. And you can see there's proof here that they were gone by December 31st, 1945, as they're not on the list. So they were there for about a year. So they were handled a little more quickly. I believe that the people, let's see if the Kuba family was still here. All right. They still are. So I don't know why they were deported so quickly, but they were. So the question is, okay, what happened to Eberhard? Now, there was an article, and there's some random newspaper article about some individual that, when he was a young kid, made the acquaintance of a Nazi spy family. He used to go over there, and they would, cook him dinner and all this stuff. And basically, what he said in summary is that this Martin Eberhard Kuehn was, prior to being able to be admitted to the military, was a foster child. And then he went to the military, and then after the war was over, he was able to do whatever he wanted to and live his life normally. So he actually turned out not having his life ruined somewhat. But this is a very interesting thing. So they're on this boat here. This is some Permanente, and they're leaving from Honolulu, Hawaii on, this is a year later. This is July 1944, and I guess this is the day of reckoning for individuals that, see, they thought, well, we've got these young German guys that maybe in about a year we can, just have them go fight for us in the army. So why don't we just, we can give them a choice whether they want to fight for us and earn their citizenship or go back home. So then that's what they did. So here's the manifest. It's insane, but here's the manifest. And they have a list of 10 people on the boat this time. And so I don't know. It sounds to me like the circumstances and some of them actually weren't really interned. But here for Kuehn, I guess it was like he's line number 10 to these people. Line number 10, admitted as a legal resident. To continue residence in exchange for, let's see. close to my eyes. I can read this. There was there was a letter from the military governor of TH's territory, Hawaii, stating in he was on parole and under the conditions of parole. So I guess, this is what happens. So he arrives down at, maybe he was heading to San Francisco. It doesn't say where they were. No, they were going to San Francisco. This is 17th July 1944. And probably when he got to San Francisco, it might take him a little while to decide they're going to drive him off to Crystal, Texas. But in the meantime, the military wanted to have a talk with him and maybe give him a chance to join the army instead. So he did. So he enlisted in September. Eventually he got married, and he died 2006 in somewhere around Jacksonville, Florida. So what's unclear is what happened to the son. Now let's go into some of the details because, there's one other thing I want to do. Okay, so I went over the Wikipedia page, and I remember this. And someone wrote this in 2007. So we know it wasn't Eberhard, the oldest son that stayed in the U.S. and after fighting in the army, pretty much lived a normal life. But he did elect to live on the East Coast. Anyway, so here is something someone wrote. Okay, so there's a Wikipedia article on the Kuehn family that, to my mind, is inaccurate. It's very fantastic as to what it says the Kuehns did. I think this, and the standards for Wikipedia are basically, well, if you could put contents in the article if it's not your original work, and you refer to some article or something else. And okay, so this guy writes in German, which seems to be revealing. My guess is that maybe this is a son of Hans Joachim now that's talking about the case, maybe remembering his brother who had died a year previously. Let's see, was it around July? And he stumbles, August. Okay, so yeah, and he stumbles across this Wikipedia article on the Kuehns that has mostly stayed the same since around 2007. But this is in the talk section of the article, and this is what he wrote. So it's actually been translated. So someone translated this, and he writes, whoever this is, and this motivated me to look into this also. Unfortunately, I cannot find the author of this article. And you got to remember, this is translated, and I can tell you right now, the last name Kuehn means bold, so we'll just substitute that when we get there. So it says, unfortunately, some German person's writing this. Unfortunately, I can't find the author of this article, but I feel it should be I'm going to interpret a little bit here. I feel it should be it's important to point out that in the meantime that there might be FBI documents that are publicly accessible eventually. Or this guy thinks they were available at some time and now they're gone, and somehow would change the contents of the article, I think. There are nevertheless meaningful proofs which Otto Kuehn was not involved by any means a feeler spy. He meant to say spy because it has in the article he was a sleeper agent, loosely interpreted Feeler Godge, sleeper agent. Godge is obviously misinterpreted, and already not at all, and not really involved in the assault on Pearl Harbor. I've come to that conclusion. This assumption and assumptions word are a component in entire of a rather obscure and chaotic attempt to hide losses before the public to be defended. They're the government's just trying to defend itself against its incompetence for being bombed in Pearl Harbor. Well, that I don't agree with. The Japanese were going to bomb Pearl Harbor and it had nothing to do with American incompetence. It had everything to do with the Japanese acting in a way we didn't expect, and that doesn't mean you're incompetent. If someone dupes you, Mr. Kuehn going to prison doesn't mean he was necessarily incompetent, but he did have some incompetence. So anyway, that's ironic, but in this time, victims of the machinery of they were just, what he's saying is they were the victims of machinery that were written off as just a small price to pay for the larger goal. And if we can still find the FBI files, I want to ask the author of this Wikipedia article. This person doesn't seem to be able to sort out that the author of this Wikipedia article could only parrot back, lest the content be deleted, things that are found in other documents. Because you're not allowed to do original work on Wikipedia, which is something I don't like at all. But anyway, I thoroughly disagree with. And it's very much, I asked the author where it is all, and it never idea came. There was a family that it didn't occur to the author that there's a family over many generations that have been suffered the consequences of what happened to Mr. Kuehn. For many generations, they haven't forgotten about it, and they know that the accusations weren't proven because they're not true. And how could this be? Who has? And then this paranoia is hitting this person. Who actually has the interest? So tell me, who's keeping this fabrication against my family alive, basically. The family they had some fortune in Hawaii. Why would he risk everything and lose his fortune in Hawaii to spy for the Japanese? Because of course he knows that it was their own money they were spending. You weren't able to replenish because they didn't get a job, but their life would have been okay. He actually had no reason to spy, basically. And he argues that this is an oversimplification of the facts. You accept it because it's a simple, you accept it because it's a simple explanation. It's easy for you to just simply put that he was a spy, but it's not easy to figure out what actually happened. And then he goes, when one points fingers to someone without asking how unjust it is, I think. I don't know what Afchin means, but I'm pretty good at making a rough idea out of gibberish. And you're guilty, therefore. You didn't look into it and you wrote this article. Well, they did. They had to look into it. But the problem is that every single source out there keeps parroting and repeating the limited information that they had, and no one is taking the time to look at this stuff even-handedly to try to, sort out what happened. One gave you its own head for thinking and not only a mouth to repeat. You were given, God gave you a brain to think and not just a mouth to parrot. Wake up, America. I do not love this country and its humans, however. I like its longing according to enemy pictures. Because so simply, the life is not, and also so what he's saying is, he's starting to not like, he's formed the opinion he doesn't like America because there's no one, the officials of the country, he doesn't, he's too harsh, honestly. But what he's saying is no one really bothered to think about. And they did, actually. I think, there are mentions in there when they were trying to figure out when the death sentence was going to be carried out, that there were embarrassing things to the FBI in there. And they eventually did just simply deport the man, but what was never repaired was the slander in the newspaper articles, that were published, and the subsequent books that persist to this day about how he certainly was a Nazi spy. And of course, and also the problem is, of course, is that all we have is Mr. Kuhn's word as to where the money came from. We don't have a way to actually verify much of what he said, whether it was true or not. And of the things we can verify, it could easily be interpreted in a different way, unfortunately. All I'm saying is that, he very, very well may have been innocent, and if he was, this is a tragedy. And I think that there are protests persisting to 2007, which is 65 years after the man was accused and jailed. 65 years. That perhaps we had performed an injustice here. After all, there's a lot of other people that's on this Crystal City internment camp that certainly were mistreated. What we're going to have, a bunch of Germans driving from hither and yon in South America to launch an invasion at Tijuana. I mean, I don't get it. I don't get why we went that far. But we did. I don't know who was involved or why, but it happened. It's obvious. You can look and see where they're from. Why is there a whole family from Honduras interned at Crystal City, Texas? Okay. So now let's look at some of the passenger lists. Now, Kuehn in his confession said that he had traveled more than once to Japan, and then he left it around 1936, I believe he said, not 35, but 36, to go to Japan to try to learn the language and then come back. And he finally gave up on learning it in Japan and went to Honolulu, Hawaii. In general, the story is confirmed, except for we do have a trip in 1935. In fact, he correctly remembered the name of the boat he was on in 1936. Not bad. There actually were 3 boat trips for him, and there were 4 for his wife. Sometimes she would go by Otto. Her latest boat trip was in 1941, before the bombing had happened. And at least on one of those trips, she had her luggage searched, and on another one of those trips, if not the same one, she was given one of her payments. So she was going back and forth to get payments from according to Mr. Kuehn, she was going back and forth to get payments from the Shanghai businessman that was that had bought her property in Germany, and she was just waiting to get paid for it. And apparently this man that was in Shanghai had no way to get to Hawaii. So either Mrs. Kuehn would have to go all the way to Japan to get this money for some reason, or if the Japanese were planning on coming to Hawaii, they would take it to her. So whoever this guy was important enough for the Japanese to follow his wishes. So anyway, yeah, there he is. He went by Otto in this case, not Bernard. but these are the trips he took. And ancestry is redundant, I will say. Some of these lists, there really was only 3. No, there's 5 here because 2 of the actual records, when you look at them, are identical, such as this one and this one. They're identical. They were just held by 2 different agencies. Isn't that great? There is some redundancy in this one. It's redundant to that one. And the dates generally correspond with the manifest, so we have them right here. Now, she had additional trips that are not as Otto-ly, but instead as Freudel, but sifting out a ship's manifest list, they didn't send a copy directly to the War Department in case there was a German spy on there. So I don't think she really changed her name on purpose, and basically she was just a housewife going to Japan, a couple trips here, and there's a couple confirming, typed up, oh, this person had arrived. This probably was when she first arrived with her son Hans Joshin. In 1936, and here she is alone, going to Los Angeles. This was in 37, and apparently to go anywhere you actually had to go down to Los Angeles to catch a boat to Germany. This was the outgoing passenger list to Yokohama, Japan. The last thing I try to confirm is whether, and a couple things. I try to find his birth record, but I didn't find it. And, thinking about it, it's a miracle that any birth records made it out of Germany. If you've ever looked at pictures or YouTube videos of the Battle of Berlin, you'll soon realize that city was left in shambles, absolutely destroyed. Don't know how any paper would have survived it. But nonetheless, some have. But not all of them. And in Sweden, they just don't have them all released. And his confession account is not specific enough. He says he has an aunt that was paying him in 1937, 38, and 39. Or it might have been 36 or 38. I can say that there were numerous women named Amelia Svensson that lived at Sweden at one time or the other for a span of over 200 years, and some were even alive or living even in 1936. Now, however, there was another piece of information that was not confirming. And what that was is there's one individual that has a family tree up for his family, and he actually has the FBI picture of friends of Bernard Joseph Otto Kuehn attached to it. And I was gonna go and look for an aunt, and it according to his tree, which is not, I could tell, is not as thorough as it could be. It could probably be improved. Seems to think that the whole family was born and died in Wisconsin. I doubt they were born in Wisconsin. I could probably check passenger lists and try to look into it further, but basically that family tree doesn't have any indication that his family came out of Sweden at all. But that doesn't mean that they didn't. It basically means that the ancestry is yet to have a good, complete tool set to be able to check Swedish records and make a connection between immigrants that are now in America and their ancestors that were once in Sweden. That's all it means. I could probably trace the individual that made the tree said had eventually died in Wisconsin. Get as much vital records out of it and get an idea when they came out. It'd be a big project. And, I'd probably get them to Germany, but would I be able to get that any solid records any further back that would point to Sweden? I would probably, even after a week of work, think that the best evidence that I have for an aunt in Sweden is his confession there. So, and I'm just speaking from experience there. It doesn't mean just because the one family tree that exists from clearly someone that's a cousin and not a direct descendant, it doesn't mean that he was lying. It's just something I can't confirm, and that's about all I could really confirm. Of course, there's no bank records anywhere that have been microfilmed and made available for people to know the same information the FBI had about the specific transactions. And even if I were able to see them, I still don't know if that would even leave any indication as to what their original origin was. Mrs. Kuehn would come back from Japan with cash in hand, which kind of makes things a little more difficult. The only chance to do any confirmation of a land sale is if title records survived the war. I doubt that, in Germany, or if perhaps there's some remaining records in some Shanghai archive about, the businessman that was doing business over there, but I doubt it. So, it'll be years before that happens, so not much I can do to confirm it, but I can know that the FBI found no evidence of him sending signals to anybody, and it would have been an impossibility. Okay, I'm going to stop now, and then I'm going to do some more details on some of the contents of the documents, because it occurs to me there's some rather eye-raising and interesting events that took place, assuming the man was innocent.